Good morning, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're doing very well today, and welcome to a Deck Tech. This is not a donation video, an assignment from anybody. This is something I have been doing for fun, brewing this list up, tweaking it, on my lunch breaks at work, a little bit before bed over the last couple days, and this is what I have settled on. This, my friends, is Orzhov Griefblade, or Grief Guy Ale, as you prefer, version 1.0. So the first thing to note is that the card Unmask, which is very much like Grief, is actually standing in for Grief, because I can't show you Grief on MTGO. This is the card Grief. If you don't know what it does, here it is. I talked about it in my previous video. I'm going to break it down thoroughly in this deck tech to show you how the engine of this deck works. But yeah, it's basically a Orzhov midrange or Dead Guy Ale list based around Grief and the various synergies that flow from that, including a lot of ones that we already liked to play in Dead Guy Ale in the first place. Very, very exciting stuff. So before we break it down, I've got to give you the caveat that this is very much a 1.0 version of the list. Three major reasons for that, my friends. Number one, simply haven't tested it, right? Card's not legal on MTGO, can't test it yet. Always definitely, gotta mention that. Number two, broadly, in context of MH2, we haven't seen the whole set, not even close. I bet there's more black-white mid-range playable cards, let's just say that, coming out in the set, broadly speaking. Whether or not they synergize with Grief, we might want them here. And part three, perhaps the most important reason this is not likely to be the final version of the deck, according to the leaks that so far have been 100% accurate, we are going to see a cycle of these elemental incarnations that have Evoke. And as I break down the engine of the deck, what it exactly does, you will be able to see that if it's pretty good, if it's like a decently powerful card, almost no matter what it does, we're likely to be interested in whatever the white elemental in this Grief cycle is going to be. So bear that all in mind. That said, this is going to still, I think, be a really good building block for the final form. It's still going to be fun to talk about and for you to watch, I hope. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you to Zach Fire 2012, a brand new patron at the Unearthed tier. Appreciate you, appreciate all patrons. Let's jump in and let's talk about Orzhov Griefblade, or Grief Guy Ale, version 1.0. Alright guys, so in order for the full list to make sense, and we will break it down line by line, first you need to understand the new tech, the new engine, exactly how it works. So Grief is a card that you can cast a couple of different ways. Firstly, you can just say, well, against opposing fair decks, if they're going a little bit slower, opposing mid-range, opposing control, they've got a lot of cards on their hand, maybe a slower big mana progression, it is definitely not unreasonable to hardcast this thing the fair way. For 4 mana on turn 4, it's basically an ETB Painless Thoughtseize, and you leave behind a 3/2 Menacing Body. Definitely not bad. Another common use case for Grief will be, let's say you turn 1 Inquisition, and you see that you're against Ad Nauseam, or some other spell-based combo deck, right? You've also got a Fatal Push in hand. Well, the Fatal Push is dead. But if you have Grief in hand, represented here again by Unmask, then you can just simply evoke to double discard on turn 1, very tempo efficient. It is value negative, you are 1 for 2ing yourself, but you're really ripping the combo player's hand to shreds, and this Fatal Push was pretty much dead anyway. So those are the two kind of use cases for Grief. They are more or less alive in any deck that you'll ever see this card in. However, there is a third and a very, very powerful, the most powerful way to use Grief is present in this shell. Combination with the card Ephemerate. So here's how this works. Turn 1, different progression, right? We're not leading on Inquisition, we just go turn 1, play a land that makes white, evoke Grief by exiling any black card from your hand. What happens is Grief will enter the battlefield, the ETB goes on the stack, but also the evoke trigger goes on the stack. So before the evoke trigger resolves, which would compel you to sacrifice Grief, you cast Ephemerate, targeting Grief. This will blink Grief, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. You are now getting 2 Grief ETBs, right? And then, if that wasn't enough, Ephemerate also has Rebound, so at the beginning of your next upkeep, you will get to target Grief a 3rd time. That means before you even go to your own turn 2 draw step, Grief ETB will have resolved 3 times, meaning that you have taken your opponent's 3 best cards away, again, before you even go to your own T2 draw step. Now, that's not value positive necessarily, it is simply a 3-for-3 trade, but we know that casting these 1-for-1 discard spells, even though it's not value positive and even though it is tempo negative, is a main reason why mid-range is viable in the first place. They're very powerful. We're talking about extreme resource trading, extreme card selection in a way, or depletion of the opponent's ability to have their best cards is more like it, and the tempo efficiency is off the charts. Again, you're basically getting 3 mana worth of discard with just 1 mana spent. And then on top of that, it actually becomes value positive because after that 3-for-3 trade, you're spending Ephemerate and Grief in the card you exiled to take away your opponent's 3 cards. You actually get a 3-2 menacing body left behind. So that is how Grief and Ephemerate work. It's an extremely powerful synergy. That is why we are all in on these cards with 4 of each, but that's not all, my friends. We also have Tidehollow Sculler. So Tidehollow Sculler also, just a reasonable Dead Guy L card in the first place, but the way that Tidehollow Sculler is templated, so it's got an ETB, and it's got a Leaves the Battlefield trigger. They're 2 separate things. So if the Leaves the Battlefield trigger resolves first before the ETB does, whatever the ETB will eventually target will be exiled permanently and can never be gotten back. So this is another synergy card with Ephemerate. You play the Sculler with the trigger on the stack, you Ephemerate it. You basically get 2 cards out of their hand this way. One of them will be able to be gotten back. If they remove the Tidehollow Sculler at some point, the exiled card will be returned to its owner's hand. The other card, gone for good. So very, very powerful synergy there. Skyclave Apparition, templated similarly, working the same way. And of course, these 2 cards cover our bases nicely. Tidehollow Sculler is yet more hand disruption, and Skyclave Apparition, we all know how good this is at answering just about anything on the battlefield. And on top of that, Stoneforge Mystic, perhaps the most individually powerful threat in the Dead Guy Ale shell. We are also able to simply blink her with Ephemerate just to get more card advantage, to tutor up all of our equipment, basically, right? If this is uncontested, you have 3 pieces of equipment. Your hard cast of the SFM tutors your first one, Ephemerate tutors the second one, the rebound of Ephemerate tutors the third one. I actually wanted to fit a 4th equipment in here for this reason, but instead I ended up going down to 3 Stoneforge Mystic, right? Because there is kind of diminishing returns with her, perhaps unlike some of these other targets. So that is the engine of the deck, my friends. That is basically a short version of how it works. Again, Unmask here is representing Grief, so we have 4 Grief, 4 Ephemerate, 4 Tidehollow Sculler, 4 Skyclave Apparition, 3 copies of Stoneforge Mystic as the main engine. The threats that are good in and of themselves synergize really well with Ephemerate, and the only thing that we're maybe lacking at first glance is more copies of Ephemerate, right? And there are some out there. There's Undying Evil, there's a couple others, but what I have opted for, I think, is the best option. It is Malakir Rebirth, and one of the big problems with Ephemerate, especially if you're playing copies 5 through 8, is we don't have an enormous creature density, right? We're not like an all-in Soul Herder Blink deck, right? So there are times when we don't necessarily want to do this, or when we could lack a target for it. We've got to have modality in these spells. Malakir Rebirth is basically a worse Ephemerate in a couple different ways. It doesn't have rebound, it costs 2 life, and it also, there is like, if the graveyard is shut off, for example, then Malakir Rebirth's ability to abuse these synergies like we are with Ephemerate is also shut off. So it's a downgrade in a few different ways, but it's a land. And it's an ETB tapped mono black land, so it's not a good land, but 2 subpar halves of an extreme modal MDFC spell/land. This is absolutely amazing. This lets us have our cake and eat it too. This lets us almost always have some kind of Ephemerate style effect, and it also lets us make our land drops. We're playing 24 lands, which is a nice high land count. We're going to comfortably curve out most of the time with our lands. Malakir Rebirth also just very nice tech in general. Even if you're not really blowing the opponent out with a ton of synergies, the fact that this is a land drop that can help you grind through removal in opposing mid-range mirrors definitely doesn't hurt, but the synergies abound, my friend. So that is basically Ephemerates number 5 through 7, as well as lands 22 through 24. Definitely big fan of that. That's the core engine of this deck. Now, as powerful as that is, there is an element of it being too cute some of the time. We do need other concerns. We aren't just packing the deck full of like a Soul Herder style deck with, you know, Charming Prince and Wall of Omens and all this other stuff. Those types of cards don't reward you as much for playing black, right? So this is kind of half in that camp, half in the camp of traditional mid-range. So to that end, let's take a look at the rest of the 60 and see what rounds this out. The rest of the land base, besides those Malakir Rebirths, is pretty much a mid-range mana base, except we don't have Field of Ruin. Why? Well, our color demands are pretty extreme. Tide Hollow Sculler is absolutely bad with Field of Ruin. You know, the fact that you cannot use Field to cast it, or to cast any of our 1-drop spells, and we now have white spells at the 1-drop slot that we need to cast as early as turn 1. All of this makes Field of Ruin a good bit worse. Fetid Heath is a pretty nice fit in this deck, in conjunction with the Bright Climb Pathways, in conjunction with the Malakir Rebirths, and as always with the basic lands. Fetid Heath, though, a non-bow of sorts with Field of Ruin, so all of these considerations, and in addition, we've got double white on turn 3, and double black on turn 3 that we need. Vanishing Verse, another one along the Tide Hollow Sculler lines. It's just not a great shell for Field of Ruin in that regard. We're trying to probably do a little bit too much, in my opinion, if we're playing fields. Now, if we only wanted 1 or 2, you could probably find a way to fit them, right? But to test out the spells, I really think going without field, totally fine. So we've got 3 pathways, 2 silent clearings for just the typical flood insurance, the aforementioned 1 Fetid Heath. We've got 5 basic lands, 4 concealed courtyards, 4 marsh flats, 2 godless shrine. It's all relatively typical. In the 1-drop slot, those aforementioned 4 Ephemerates, we also have only 4 Inquisition of Kozilek. We are playing that and no copies of Thoughtseize. Why? Well, we've got the Tide Hollow Scullers at turn 2 discard, even by themselves. We've got the Ephemerate and Grief synergy for some insane discard, and on top of that, we've got Liliana of the Veil. I'm pretty confident that playing more than 4 targeted discard spells is going to be a little bit too much, right? It's just going to be too much discard, and I almost question whether we even need all 4 of these Inquisitions. That said, it's still one of the most powerful things the deck can do individually in a vacuum. I'm going to start here. You know, we can always +1 some excess ones away with Liliana. We'll see how it goes, right? But I think that's about right. We also have 3 copies of Fatal Push, not the 4th. Here's another Ephemerate synergy target that I did not mention. It is Shriekmaw. Shriekmaw, it has Evoke. It's one of the original Evoke elementals, in fact. It's a 3/2 with Fear. So again, you can hardcast it for 5 in the late game. ETB, it's kind of a terror, right? Is that the thing? Destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. And, of course, the Evoke cost means it can be a 1-for-1 removal spell on turn 2, but if you've got Ephemerate up and it's turn 3, forget about it. Shriekmaw is going to absolutely destroy the opposing board, assuming it's not full of Shadows and Scourges of the Skyclave. So Shriekmaw, in some ways, kind of the Fatal Push number 4. Again, we're just building into our synergies that little bit more. We have a 1 of Cling to Dust, which I always love in these types of decks. We are discarding the opponent out pretty heavily. Of course, Cling can clean up any graveyard value they might get. Cling also has X for 1 potential in and of itself. Cling also just cantripping early can help us curve out. So, forgot to mention Shriekmaw earlier, but that's part of this threat suite. And rounding out the list is a 1 of Vanishing Verse in the main deck. I think with this, or with a traditional Dead Guy Ill, I would be on a 1/1 Vanishing Verse split right now. Main inside. That, of course, can change when MH2's dust settles. Maybe it becomes more desirable, maybe a little bit less. For now, if I were to magically have access to these cards today and play them in a league, I'd be on 1 main, 1 side. And a pretty typical Stoneforge Mystic package with just kind of the the highest quality weapons that give us the most coverage and the least redundant overlap. We have Batterskull, Fire and Ice, Feast and Famine, and as mentioned, I could really see making room for a fourth one if we are just finding ourselves ephemerating or Malakir rebirthing Stoneforge Mystic more often than not. Let's take a look at that sideboard now. Remember, with Grief, you have to evoke it by exiling a black card from your hand, so we are erring on the side of black cards when possible. The only white card in the sideboard, the only mono-white card or non-black card, is Auric Champion, who I believe is still kind of best in class for what she does. I do like her in Stoneforge Mystic deck simply because she can pick up a weapon. It's nice to have your lock pieces or your hard hate on legs for that reason. One potential problem with her, though, is that if you look at the red decks playing Kozilek's Return, they're already going to bring them in against us, right? Shriek Maw, Stoneforge Mystic, Tide Hollow Sculler, Skyclave Apparition, even Grief, they're all toughness 2. So we already get wrecked by Kozilek's Return. That is already an out to Auric Champion. Just something to keep in mind when you're building the deck for actual play. But for now, I think this at least represents what we want from this slot and is still in every other way probably the best option that we have. Every other card is black. We already mentioned the Vanishing Verse. I like a One of Fracture. I haven't really tested it yet, but I think the card plays. It's a Disenchant Plus effect, destroying Planeswalkers. Very, very nice. I'm opting for 2 copies of Plague Engineer. Now, everyone knows how much I love the Plague Man. He's not as necessary broadly in a vacuum right now as he's been, right? Here's the thing, though. Plague Engineer is definitely one of the best-in-class board control cards still, even if he's not as well-positioned as maybe he used to be a year ago. And we are maybe heavier on hand disruption and just a tad bit lighter, unless we're like chaining Shriek Maw triggers or something, or chaining Skyclave Apparition triggers together, than maybe a typical black-based mid-range deck is. So Plague Engineer, even though it's not particularly synergistic with Ephemerate, neither is Auric Champion for that matter. This is still a Stoneforge Mystic deck. These are still really powerful hate bears that shore up necessary gaps that we need to plug and can pick up a sword and go to town after we do a little bit of depleting. So that's why he's in there. And then we have 2 Foros rounding out the sideboard. And again, you could do any number of things with a sideboard. This is what I've opted to do. 4 copies of Fulminator Mage. This is simply a nod to the fact that we are not playing Field of Ruin. We do have a relatively slow clock, although with the prospect of getting Grief to stick on turn 1, it is maybe even a little bit quicker than a normal Dead Gael deck. Still not the quickest, though, so we can deplete them and disrupt them all we want. We've got to also basically blow up a land or 2 to get over the line against big mana, even after all of our discard most of the time. So 4 copies of Fulminator Mage, pretty nice. And then 4 copies of Leyline of the Void. I think Leyline is unusually good here. I wouldn't play Leyline in like a normal Dead Gael list right now, but there's a lot of reasons to play it right now. Number 1, we don't have Bobs, so it's not like a 4-drop that you can flip. That's definitely a concern in Dark Confidant. Number 2, we have the ability to kind of turn excess copies into value with the evoke off of our Griefs, right? You can definitely get some good mileage out of that, in addition to pitching them to Liliana if they're not live. And number 3, we are discarding so heavily, starting on turn 1, that the very best thing we can do against a lot of decks is obviously all in graveyard decks, graveyard combo decks, whatever, but even against decks that heavily use their graveyard, such as maybe Rakdos midrange, right? Or Lurrus decks. Leyline of the Void's actually going to be pretty darn good against them. It's going to make our discard that much more relevant, that much more backbreaking, and I think we have enough incentives in this shell to play a full 4 copies of a card that is not necessarily a mid-range card per se, unlike Nile Spellbomb, which is a classic mid-range card. So there you go, my friends. Those are my thoughts. This is version 1.0 of Orzhov Griefblade, or Grief Gael. I think this card Grief is going to bring a lot of grief to a lot of players in MH2 Modern once that is legal. Again, the biggest thing that we are expecting to introduce into this deck is Grief's White Kin. Maybe we get Gerard's Verdict in MH2, and then we'll have to reimagine this, in my opinion, kind of from the ground up, right? We're also getting into too much discard territory. That might even be better in a straight-up dead guy list, even with Grief playing a more minor role, or not at all, I'm not sure. And then anything and everything can happen. I'm hyped for the MH2 spoilers, my friends. I hope you are too. Thank you so much for watching. Of course, let me know what you think about this list. I think it's a pretty good one to kick things off, but there are a million different directions you could take it as far as tweaks go. Please do let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Thank you once again to Zach Fire 2012. Appreciate your support, and I will talk to you soon.